Well, hello friends, and welcome back again to the Cattleman's Corner. I'm back here with our K-State Research and Extension, State Extension Beef Extension State Vet, however you want to put those words together, Dr. AJ Tarpoff. And AJ's back with us again today, and we're going to visit a little bit about something that's kind of a hot topic through the summer months, and just discuss some various parasites and parasite loads, and go into a little bit more depth on those topics. So Doc, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Barrett.
So. Again, probably the big one as things start to green up or have greened up, and even through the summer, at least the first I think of is fly count, fly control, and honestly, the hindrance it can be to a producer's bottom line. And so,
absolutely, big time. We talk about the ones we can see. Okay, horn flies. We can all see horn flies. We've seen them on animals all over the place. If animals are grazing, chances are that they may have interaction with horn flies. Now, these are the little black flies that live on the back. We go out and check our cows first thing in the morning, and there'll be flies that are usually up over the withers, okay, up over the shoulders. Those are horn flies. Now, it's been estimated that horn flies cost the cattle industry about $1 billion a year. That's $1 billion with a B. So yes, they are blood feeders. They hinder performance. They hinder lactation and milk production. You know, all this is very well documented. So yes, horn flies are a big issue.
And I think, with that, all of us can go out and say, we have a fly issue, or, well, fortunately for us at this time, we're still sitting pretty good. But that threshold, it doesn't take very many flies. And if I remember correct, on a study that maybe Dr. Blasey did on some stocker cattle, their threshold, for example, was 200 flies on the animal. Well, 200, that sounds like a fair number, but really, you might be surprised what that looks like when you might see an animal that you say they're not too overridden with flies, but it's actually the opposite. It doesn't take very many on the back of an animal to really start hindering some of those things that you mentioned.
It doesn't. So the economic threshold. When do we start losing money? When do these flies hinder performance? Things of that nature. It, just like you alluded to, is 200 to 300 horn flies. That's the economic threshold. But we have grad students here at the university that will look at a picture and count all those individual flies. We're not asking producers to do that. But what does the visual representation of 200 to 300 horn flies on an animal look like? And how I like to graph it out is first thing in the morning, and I mentioned first thing in the morning because as the day progresses and it gets hot, the sun comes out, those flies, they usually live on the back sides of animals. They actually migrate and they go underneath the belly, so they're harder to judge the amount that's on them. But how I like to picture it is if it goes from the elbow on one side up over the withers to the other elbow, on the front side of the animal, that's about 300 horn flies.
Okay. So
that's a good, kind of keep that in your back pocket, that if you go from elbow up over the withers to the other elbow, that's 300 horn flies.
A great point of judgment or reference there. Some other things, horn flies that can bring unrest to an operation, obviously, as well. You mentioned they're biting flies, and so with that, we've had from east to west a continuous rise of anaplasmosis.
Yep.
And so obviously that's more of a tick-borne disease, but maybe talk a little bit about pathogens that can be transferred from both flies and ticks, and give us just a quick bit of insight on some of that.
So thankfully, horn flies don't transmit anaplasmosis or some of the other bloodborne issues. That's due to their life cycle. Horn flies spend their entire life cycle on one animal. The only time they leave that animal is to go lay eggs and fresh manure, and then they come back to that animal. It's amazing how they can pinpoint specific animals within a herd. So when we're talking about anaplasm, bloodborne transfer, yes, ticks can be a pretty big cause. The others are stable flies. Okay, so stable flies can actually transmit some of these pathogens. These are the painful biting flies that bite the lower legs. Okay, and that's when cattle are swishing their tails, stomping their feet. Those are stable flies, and if you've ever been working cows and been bit by a stable fly, it's not a comfortable bite. Then horse flies. Okay, horse flies are big. They have a really nasty bite where they'll attach themselves to the sides of cattle. They can actually start bleeding. So when we think about anaplasma, the flies, they can mechanically transfer it from one animal to another during their painful, nasty biting. Ticks, specifically the brown dog tick, here in Kansas, it is a biologic vector of anaplasmosis, where they feed on one animal that is a positive carrier, and that organism, that bacteria that causes anaplasma, replicates inside of that tick. So when it drops off and it waits for the next animal to come by and it attaches to that next animal, it injects a large amount of that pathogen into the next animal.
So maybe I would ask from there, Doc, just a little bit, and we know we have a couple other parasites to talk about in terms of worms and things of that nature, but while we're on flies and ticks here, let's talk quickly about some control options and things producers should be having in the back of their mind entering fly and tick season.
When we look at control products that we can use to help control external parasites, the list of products are about this long, okay? But I think it's important to understand what we're using, why we're using them, and making sure that they're going to be effective into the future. There's basically 3 different classes of products that we utilize for external parasites. Those would be pyrethrins, organophosphates, and then some avermectin. Okay, so those are the 3 classes. But then we have, how can we get these products to the animal? Well, we have feed-through products, okay, that we may have in a mineral supplement, we may have in a feed that we're actually administering it to. Then we have fly tags, okay, insecticide-impregnated ear tags. They've been around for a long time. Believe it or not, they were developed against the ear tick. Okay, so but they're labeled for flies, and some of them are labeled for flies and ticks. So we have the fly tags. Also, we have oilers, dusters, you name it. That we have some of the availability. Sprays. Okay, either low dose or high volume. Sprays that are mixed up and actually applied to groups of animals. We have spot-ons that we apply. From the back of the head, from the poll all the way to the tail head. These are all the different options that we have available. But I do want to mention about the feed through. Okay, there's a couple of different products that are used for a feed through. Now, these actually help destroy the larva in the fresh manure. Okay, regardless of the product, it's the same basic idea. Either it interferes with the development of the larva, the egg that hatches in the fresh manure, inhibits its ability to hatch into an adult, or it actually kills the larva. Now, that's great for environmental control. We can reduce the population, but keep in mind, last time I checked, flies don't stop at fence lines.
Right. And I think that's a great point, and I hear that at the local level quite a bit, just in hashing out some of those options that you talked about, and you bring up a feed-through additive, and well, I've never seen a mineral that actually works, but that's a great point. It's not a fly repellent or deterrent like some of our other options are, but if you kind of stick with it, it's more of an over time type solution that will hopefully reduce the eggs or the larvae that do mature, and I think that's a great point, and certainly not a cure-all, no. as very few products in the beef industry are, right?
And I bring that up for a specific point. And for proper external parasite control, it needs to be multimodal. Okay, so having a feed-through product that's in maybe a mineral mix, that's a great tool, and we can reduce the amount, but we need to back it up with something. Okay, and what might we back it up with? Ear tags, okay, or sprays, anything like that. I think it's important to understand that the realistic expectations of how long these products last. Okay, this isn't a one-time treatment and you're done. Fly tags. Okay, read your label, work with your veterinarian, because we do have to rotate these impregnated ear tags. We do have to rotate those a very specific way to make sure that we don't breed resistance into these horn flies. because these horn flies will have about 30 generations throughout the grazing season. So if they're naturally resistant to one of these products, they still breed rapidly throughout the grazing season. So we want to make sure that we rotate them appropriately, but realistic expectation, the labels are 12 all the way up to 20 weeks of duration. So keep in mind, when did you put those tags in? Okay, did we put them in the middle of March? We can't expect those products to still have lasting effect going out to early September, where we usually see another kind of peak fly count.
And I think that, again, another great point. We're not here saying, take your cattle out to grass and then bring them back in. We know we've got to get to grass when we have the opportunity in any given year, and especially for some earlier calving type herds, they may have an opportunity in a wet year most of the time to get to grass more timely. Well, that's probably before a big portion of the fly load really comes into play. Like I said, the feasibility of getting out to pasture and bringing them back in just to apply fly tags, probably not there, which is okay, but don't be disappointed or alarmed or upset with the manufacturer or me in particular for telling you to use them or something when they do probably run out of gas at that point wherever the label reads. And I would maybe even mention also 12 to 20 is the range you mentioned, Doc. Maybe the expectation, just hedge on the side of caution there or the lower side, and know that's probably all the goodie that we're going to get out of those. On the flip side of that, I want to talk about the sprays a little bit, largely duration. Again, we know that oftentimes once we start spraying, it feels like we just have to keep going back, and that is because of the duration of that product's efficacy, so to speak, and maybe just hit on that a little bit.
So whenever we use these topical products, sprays, pour-ons, things of that nature, the realistic expectation, depending on the product, is only 2 to 4 weeks. Okay, some have pretty good coverage out to 4 weeks. Some, we're reducing the adult load, where the adult loads we get killed and they drop off, but we still have developing flies in the environment that are coming up through the larval stages that will reinfest animals. So 2 to 4 weeks of control. The sprays, they're not long lasting. Okay, they work locally. It's all topically. They're not absorbed systemically. That we have constant effect. That these sprays, that we spray them up, we kill the adults, and they will get reinfested. Okay, so if you're going to rely on some of these topical products throughout the entire season, have that in mind and be prepared that we will need multiple follow-up treatments. Now, I'll kind of piggyback about the fly tags. We use them early because that's when they're going to grass, which it isn't necessarily a bad idea, especially if you have tick issues. That tick issues usually occur kind of earlier in the spring, so having those tags in early, it's a trade-off. Now, the big thing with when those tags lose their efficacy, when you run those cows back through in the fall for preg check, make sure we cut those tags out. Okay, we do have to cut those fly tags out of cows and bulls, whatever you have them applied into. We need to get those removed, because once they dip down below that threshold where they actually affect the fly population, that's where we can breed resistance. Okay, so if you use tags, make sure you remove them at the end of the season. Before I leave fly tags, I briefly talked about rotation of fly tags. Okay, I've had numerous folks that say, Doc, well, I use those fly tags and they stopped working. Well, if you use the same product year after year, they will stop working, and that is due to the resistance in those hornfly populations. So the entomologists that around the U.S. They had made some basic recommendations on fly tag rotation. Okay, I talked about the 3 different classes of products that we use against flies. Pyrethrins was the first one I mentioned. Pyrethrin, you can only use 1 year out of every 3. Okay, unfortunately, hornflies develop resistance rapidly to those. The next one, organophosphate. Okay, you can use an organophosphate 2 out of 3 years. Okay, the third product that's available out there is an abamectin. And abamectin, we truly could use a 3-year rotation of fly tags if that's what the producer and your veterinarian recommends. You could either do a 2-product rotation or a true 3-product rotation, but you would be changing that either every year or every other year, depending on the product that you're using.
And so let me ask you, I think you just answered my question then. Say we're combining, as you mentioned, multimodal fly control, and we're going to use a tag, but when we go to grass, we're also going to hit with the pour-on, or maybe later we're going to utilize a spray. It sounds like we shouldn't have one of those be a pyrethrin and one be an organophosphate, because say pyrethrin, say we put those in as a spray or a pour-on method, and then the next year we use them as our choice of ear tag. Does that have the same effect on reduced
efficacy, right? So the late season is typically when we'll be changing up a product usage, and late season, so we put tags in into March. Okay, we lose efficacy late August when we really need that tag to be functional. So we have an opportunity that we can have an impact on our animals, so that we may use a spray. We may use something else late season. It is actually recommended to reduce the overall environmental population that goes into the winter. That if we used one class of insecticide with a fly tag, if we come back late season with a retreatment, we will switch insecticide class just to reduce the overall amount that goes into winter. Okay. One thing about sprays is they don't have a lot of residual. Okay, they don't have the residual activity that lasts for a long period. So sprays by themselves don't harbor as much risk of developing resistance as fly tags, because there's constant exposure throughout the entire season.
Sure, makes sense. AJ, real quick, as we kind of continue our conversation on parasites here, dewormers. The good, the bad, the ugly, that they're absolutely necessary, and that's, something that we can't see. As you mentioned at the top of the show, we've been kind of hashing out on flies and ticks. However, as I mentioned, just as necessary. Maybe talk about differences, oral wormers, pour-ons, whatever the case may be, and just give us a bit of insight in that regard.
Yeah, so dewormers and internal parasites, that are another huge hinder to the livestock industry. It's huge. Okay, but again, flies are easy to see. We can't see the internal parasites, and they hinder digestion, protein digestion. Usually, it's growing animals. We have the biggest issue with some of our internal parasites. I do want to bring up that as cows mature, once they hit about 3 years of age, they've developed pretty decent immunity against a lot of these internal parasites. But keep in mind, cattle only get infected with internal parasites when they're grazing. Okay, so these bugs have adapted to the environment, whether you're in far South Texas or up in Montana or here in Kansas, they adapt to their environment. So they only shed eggs and are infective whenever their survivability is high. So for us, that's during the grazing season during the summer. So the eggs get passed into the manure. The eggs hatch, and these little larvae crawl up on grass blades. So as cattle come by and graze, that's where they pick up the infective larvae and get infested with some of these internal parasites. So yes, the products that are available, like you mentioned, we have orals, we have pour-ons, we have injectables. There's several different classes. We have the macrocytic lactones, and then we have more of our what we consider white wormers. Right? There are different modes of action. All right, and the modes of action come into play. Especially depending on what animals we're trying to treat. They are avermectins that are kind of in our macrocytic lactones. These are our typical insecticides, okay? The injectables, the pour-ons that we've been accustomed to over the last 30 years or so. They work against some internals and also external parasites, okay? Mm-hmm. So there's a balancing act on what we're trying to control at that period of time. The orals, okay, they work directly where they gets into the digestive tract. They work directly against those internals, and they don't work against anything else. So that's good to understand. Now, I do want to throw out a point of caution. Okay, generics. Okay, not all generics are created equal. Okay, I do want to point that out. Unfortunately, with our dewormers, the generics, not all of them have gone through all of the bioequivalence is what we call it, and with pharmaceuticals, not all of them have actually proven to have the same carriers as the name brand. They may not be the same. All the other components may not be the same in those products, where sometimes we can lose some efficacy on those. So again, that's where use your local asset, your local practitioner. Have that discussion on how can we properly control internal parasites in my operation? Do I need to change something up? Is there another way or a newer product, something else that I can incorporate to make sure that I have maximum control so I don't hinder performance and weaning weights on some of my young growing animals?
You bet. And that's, the name of the game, and ultimately, especially as we think about a summer grazing season, we are working to that. Now, coming off a winter like this one, probably the most exciting thing about summer grazing season is the fact that we can just get out on pasture, right? But at the end of the day, it still has to be just as an efficient and effective form of management, because ultimately we're going to turn spring pairs at least out and expect to be able to wean a big calf. And our parasite loads, whether it be flies, ticks, internal parasites, they're going to play a huge role, and as Doc has discussed, can really, producers can benefit by being ahead of the game and on top of it. And so, as always, I encourage you, if you have any questions on parasites or on anything in particular for the summer grazing season, to reach out to myself or your local extension office, or of course, always feel free to call our state extension beef vet, Dr. A.J. Tarpoff here, and we'll be glad to visit with you on whatever ails you at that point in time. So with that, Doc, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
So.